Argentina has announced a new wealth tax which will affect wealthy people more and expats more. On this video, I'm going to tell you why I think more countries might follow suit and why it could affect more people globally. Now, Argentina has announced a new tax on expats and indeed wealthy people. Now, a lot of people have heard about the fact that Argentina are looking to put in a one-off tax on the so-called wealthy, but what they haven't always picked up on is that Argentina plans to levy a higher tax on people living outside the country than inside the country. Now, the reason that is significant is this. It starts with people who are earning, or sorry, should I say, they've got a wealth of about $2.5 million or more. Now, the reason it's significant is this, right? If you're an Argentinian living in New York City, $2.5 million is debatable whether you can retire on that kind of money if you're living in Manhattan, certainly. In fact, it's much less money than if you're in Argentina, right? Because of the cost of living. And in addition to that, Argentina does not tax expats on income. So the fact that Argentina have de facto brought in a tax on expats, in other words, it's not even the same as people living in Argentina. So to be clear, if you're an Argentinian living in Argentina, you will face this one-off tax and they're going to levy it as a one-off fee. So let's say you've got $10 million in wealth, so that's 7.5 million above the threshold. You could be taxed as much as 3 to 5%. But if you live outside of Argentina, it could actually be more. So I think the Argentinian rate, it goes up to 3.5%, I think, but the rate for Argentinians living overseas is up to 5.5%. So it's huge, right? If you're quite wealthy and you're living in Europe or Brazil or America, Canada, it could be huge. Now, of course, they might not be able to collect this in reality because it's on wealth. Some people's wealth is tied up in property and it isn't easy to sell, but that's not the point. It shows that attitudes to the wealthy are getting worse around the world. And in addition to that, because expats live far away, it's far easier to target them because locally speaking, there might be some sympathy because most people, most middle-class people will know that little old lady who's 80 and's never particularly had a high income, but she's inherited a big house and she's so-called house poor. In other words, she has a low income, but she's living in a huge house because her husband died or whatever. There's more sympathy, whereas the person living in New York or London who's in a similar situation, there's going to be less sympathy because they seem so far away, even though obviously you've got YouTube and all those things now. And so people can relate a bit more. So I actually think this could be a way to bring in wealth taxes around the world and expat taxes. In other words, rather than countries in Europe or Canada or Australia going towards taxes on income, they might bring in one-off levies on wealth, but people living outside the country need to pay more, which de facto is an expat tax. In other words, let's say the British government said, right, anyone who's worth more than £2 million is going to pay a one-off levy of between 1% and 5%, depending on how much they're worth. In other words, 5% might be for billionaires, 1% could be for people who have just got a couple of million. But by the way, if you live outside of the UK, we're going to double those rates. Of course, it's an expat tax by definition, and it's an easier sell than targeting people who live locally in the country. Now, of course, it's silly, right? Because a lot of people, I highly suspect a lot of Argentinians will look to kind of give up their citizenship in the same way that many Americans did it after FATCA. But in developing countries, it's going to be much more likely that people want to give up their citizenship. And I mean, that's the nonsense of it all, right? Because an Argentinian who was born in Argentina but has already given up their citizenship, of course, it wouldn't be possible to charge them this tax at all. So more people might look to kind of give up their citizenship. But the point is, this could start to affect more countries. And it reminds me of something. I can remember 13 or 14 years ago, I was watching a documentary about British people living in Monaco in Europe. And there was many people featured on the documentary. I can't remember the name now, but one of the people featured on the documentary, he wasn't actually that high income. Yeah, he was relatively high income, but he was at that kind of level whereby, yes, he would have saved taxes living in Monaco, but the cost of living would have been quite high for him. In other words, if you think about it, it's much cheaper to live in the UK in terms of cost of living compared to Monaco, but you have to pay much higher taxes. And they asked him, the interviewer asked him, well, why do you live in Monaco then? Because overall, yes, you pay less tax, but the cost of living is higher, so are you really better off? And he said, well, one of the reasons I'm living in Monaco isn't just for the savings and tax savings, but it's also because I feel like in the UK there's this culture of supporting the underdog, and people don't always think that wealth is a good thing. It's not like in the 1980s where the attitudes were quite pro-business. I'm feeling like increasingly people are anti-business, anti-making wealth. And the interesting thing is, remember, that was 13 years ago. That was before the economic crisis. That was before Occupy Wall Street. That was even before coronavirus. Some people are even trying to say that wealthy people caused coronavirus when, of course, that wasn't the case. You can remember back in March and April and May when people were very sensitive, and yes, there were some profiteers doing very bad things like hiking the price of drugs, but at that time people were very sensitive about people even making money. I can remember I did an email campaign for people who are on my mailing list, and I announced that I'd had a new partnership with a firm in America, and somebody replied saying, shame on you for making money during moments like this. But it shows the kind of attitudes that people are increasingly having in some Western countries. And that kind of Monaco documentary, if that was made now, I think that would be even more the case. In other words, attitudes to the rich and the wealthy have gotten worse over time, gradually since, say, the 80s during the Thatcher-Reagan kind of revolution, or so-called revolution. Gradually over time, attitudes have got worse. And what I've noticed through all the years is just the targets changed slightly. So in 2007, 8, 9, it was the bankers. We don't like the bankers. That's kind of moderated now. Bankers aren't public enemy number one. Now it's kind of big tech, who used to be the good guys. It always changes, but the media often have this kind of way of looking at things, and we see it again with Philip Green, who now lives in Monaco. I'm not saying the way he's behaved has always been great, but you know what I mean, there's always a new public enemy number one. But the thing is, regardless of whether that's justified or not justified, it starts to affect all wealthy people as a group, and even people who aren't especially wealthy. Because what's interesting about this Argentina wealth tax is it is on people who have got wealth, which is actually pretty normal for older people to have. If you think about it, 2.5 million, yes, most people don't have that, but you take it, if somebody bought a few apartments in Buenos Aires in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and now they're an old person, a lot of them will have this kind of money. It's going to affect a lot of people who are wealthy, but not even rich, not even high income. So I think increasingly more countries might follow this Argentinian model. In other words, rather than taxing expats, taxing wealthy people on income, there's going to be one-off charges. It's going to be justified in a populist way by saying, oh yes, we're going to use that money to help coronavirus, just like Argentina's been saying. And politically, it's going to be hard to actually counter this for a lot of people. So people have got to be prepared and be flat-footed, because you take it, an Argentinian who already has 2 or 3 passports is going to be able to deal with this much better than someone who only has an Argentinian passport. And I think personally, what's going to happen in the next 10 or 15 years, the number of wealthy people who want second passports is going to skyrocket, because the number of countries that are going to say, well, you should pay for coronavirus is going to go up. And as a final comment, I would say this. These things are always justified as temporary measures, but they often stay. I'll give you an example. In the financial crisis 12 or 13 years ago, in the UK, the Labour Party, they increased the tax from, or above 150,000, it went up from 40% to 50%. So it went up by 10%. But at the time, the UK's leader, Gordon Brown, said, this is a temporary measure. It will just be there for a few years after the economic crisis. Then a few years later, the Conservative Party decreased it to 45%. And the Labour Party said, oh, it's a tax cut on the rich, forgetting that it used to be 40%, including under their regime. But then the Conservative Party have kept that rate for the last 12 years, and they haven't increased it in line with inflation. In other words, 10 years ago, it was the same tax as now, and of course indirectly that's dragged more people into the tax threshold, because remember, £150,000 12 or 13 years ago is the equivalent of about £135,000 pounds today, or even less, because of 2 or 3% inflation compounds. So what often happens is, and it happened in the US as well when they brought in the income tax, they started out saying, oh, we've got to pay for World War I, World War II, we've just got to put in tax, and we'll start it on a small amount on just the very wealthy people. But of course, you know what happens, right? Over time, it either gets increased or it doesn't get increased, but inflation just kind of eats into that, and more people pay it. So for example, let's say the UK government brought in a wealth tax on anyone earning or has more than £2 million in wealth. All they would have to do is just keep it at that level for 20 or 30 years, and pretty much half the population would pay, because inflation kind of makes that certain, unless the UK went into a Japan-style situation where there's no inflation for a decade or more. So the point is, people should prepare for this. They should prepare for new taxes because of coronavirus and look at their options.